the republic that I believe is now threatened with its demise, as developments are taking place in the United States that clearly portend the end of our liberty if we don't wake up and do something about it. I was very pleased, by the way, and I know we're not being partisan here tonight, but I'm not. I believe, unlike some folks in the Virginia legislature, that when you mention the President of the United States, you have actually mentioned the people that he represents, who chose and put him in office. You are actually mentioning the one who represents their constitutional sovereignty before the nation and before the world. And that when you treat that representative without respect, you have actually violated your oath to uphold, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. But I have to say, I was profoundly impressed that for the first time in a long while, this 4th of July, thanks to the President's initiative, we actually heard the words of the most famous passage of the Declaration of Independence, quoted in full. Some of you probably heard it. Well, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. I was impressed because everywhere I've gone in the course of my time in political life, I have found it more and more and more to be the case that the people who stand before the American people act as if we now live under a law that requires that we never mention in politics and in public the name of our Almighty God. I will plead guilty, and I will be affirming that guilt in the course of my talk this evening, that I try never to stand before any audience in this country or anywhere else without reminding them that the bedrock foundation of our claim to independence, of our claim to rights, of our claim to just government in the United States is the authority of Almighty God. Turn your back on that authority, and you have turned your back on every right, including liberty. Because it is only by evoking the name of that transcendent authority of God that we are able to understand the real meaning of our rights. I often ask people, what is the opposite of right? Wrong. Take note of the fact that the opposite of right is not slavery. The opposite of right is not bondage. Those things are the opposite of freedom. But right is not simply freedom. Right is the freedom exercised to do what God has substantiated, what God has endowed as the right and just thing to do. Abandon God, and you have abandoned the concept of unalienable rights. Abandon that concept, and you have abandoned your liberty, along with every other attribute that makes us human, that makes us free. We have forgotten that as a people, and on account of allowing others to dissuade us from remembering it, we are cowering now in our pews, cowering now in the shadows, acting as if we must be ashamed of our faith, ashamed of the gospel that in fact accounts for the founding and rise of the greatest nation and the only true republic in the history of mankind. If we really mean to save our country, then we must bring this silence to an end. And in doing so, I believe we will take a stand that might finally set the example that Governor Bevin has already shown, but that every governor and every representative and every member of the legislature worthy to represent a free people must begin to show in the United States. They must remember that we did not fight and die for an abstraction. We fought and died on the basis of the faith that inspired those patriots who knew that against the odds they stood to be defeated by what was then perhaps the greatest military power on earth. But they stood and they fought and they died and they triumphed, because there is no power greater than the power of God when that power is exemplified in the will of a people who will not run, who will not yield, who will stand for what is right according to God, even though it means the death of all they hold dear except their liberty. When we rediscover that that was the true meaning of their independence, then we will have returned to the foundation which alone is likely to secure, maintain, preserve, and pass on to our posterity our own liberty, our own prosperity, our own independence. Now, there are issues that I think exemplify this more than others. And the main one is the one that was briefly mentioned as I was being introduced. And people often ask me why it is. As a matter of fact, a young lady years ago asked me, why do you talk so much about abortion? Actually, I don't talk that much about abortion per se. What I talk about is the grave injustice that is involved in withdrawing the protection from nascent human children in the womb that is clearly extended by our Constitution in fulfillment of the promise of our Declaration. For our Declaration began, as we just heard, by making the unalienable right to life the first in pride of place in the list of all the rights that we have and that may be. And why was that done? I don't think it's just because it is the precondition of all others. I think it's because once you have been deprived of your sense that government exists to secure the just respect that God requires for your lives, then you have authorized the government to do what was done time and again in all of the socialist and communist and dictatorial and despotic little tyrannies throughout the world. Once they know that persons have no rights that government has to respect, then they know that power knows no limits that morality demands they respect. And they have not just killed people by the tens or by the thousands, as we will find on battlefields throughout the history of the world. They have killed them, leading them like sheep to the slaughter by the tens of millions. And it is going on even as we speak today. Why are there so many in our republic, particularly among our younger generations, who do not understand that we have been spared the scourge of that tyranny and that dictatorship because we are a republic founded not upon the authority of government, but upon the authority of God? We do not get our fundamental rights, the fundamental rights that make of us a free people, from the hand of government. We get them from the hand of God. And we will not keep them by respecting laws that trample on those rights. We will keep them by respecting the mandates of God that demand that we take responsibility, first for ourselves, and then for our children, and then for our families, and then for our community, so that we may act responsibly to preserve the independence and prosperity of our nation in the world. Are we still such a people? I don't know. We have become, I'm afraid, a nation that seems to be cowed now by lies. Lies. The separation of church and state, as they have presented it in our courts, is a pure and simple lie. When will we begin not just to speak, but to act against that lie? How can a nation founded on the concept of God endowed unalienable rights with a constitution written to secure those rights, how can we ever hope to maintain those rights if we forget the authority from which they come and raise up our children to believe, as one young lady said to me in New Hampshire years ago when I was running for president? I asked her, where do your rights come from? And she said, they come from the Bill of Rights. And I said, well, wait a minute. When the people sat down to write the Bill of Rights, how did they know what rights you had? See, because if the rights come from the Bill of Rights, you can't know them until you've written the Bill of Rights, but you can't write the Bill of Rights if you don't know you have these rights. As you can guess, she didn't have an answer to that question. But she should have. She should have known the answer that was given tonight. Where do your rights come from? Your rights come from Almighty God. It's right there in the Declaration, which is not, by the way, and I always do this, I'm always careful to do this, though I will quote Scripture anytime at the drop of a hat. I don't mind quoting Scripture. But the first thing I always do is quote the Declaration. Everybody forgets, Declaration is part of the organic law of the United States. And the organic law is the law that doesn't define what we do, it defines who we are. We are being invited to step away from the family of humanity, to step away from the identity that we can trace all the way back to Adam and Eve, to step away from the common bond, the common understanding, the common heart, the common goodwill that is supposed to characterize our relations as human beings, to retreat into our identity as whites and blacks and Asians and Jews and Catholics and Protestants. When will we remember that what the founders did to challenge all those divisions so that we could form a more perfect union that we are obliged, if we have sworn the oath, to continue to perfect today? What they did was not to stand on the ground of our divisions and our differences and our colors and our creed, but to stand on the ground of our God and the justice that He demands we show to every other human being of His creation. This is what has given truth to that wonderful phrase, one nation under God. But it is also what ought to remind us that we cannot possibly remain one nation if we forget that the common ground on which we stand across all these bounds and divisions that they wish now to foment so that we will be at one another's throats. We can avoid all of that only if we are willing not to go to battle against one another in the name of their false ideologies, but rather to join in prayer with one another, that we may find the courage to uphold these self-evident truths, evident to us because of our common faith in a creed that transcends humanity, that points to the authority of being itself, that has endowed us with the capacity to see through all those differences to the heart we share for what is just and right and good for our families, for our children, but also for all of humankind. I have never been able to forget in my life that we Americans, when we look back, whoever we might be, are capable of taking pride, not in everything. You think I take pride in slavery and the terrible oppression that was meted out to my ancestors? Of course I don't. You think I take pride in the greed that dictated often that people will be stomped in the name of licentious profit under the boot heel of power, no matter what their claims to better treatment? No, you can bet I don't. But there is one thing I do take pride in. I take pride in the fact that even those who bore some such prejudice, even those who practiced some such greed, were willing to band together from time to time and again when a call was made, even though it went out about the oppression of nations they did not know and peoples whom they heartily despised. They would go to die on battlefields for the sake of those people, not because they loved them, but because they loved God more than they loved themselves and were unwilling to see the truth of his justice abandoned. There are cemeteries filled with the brave souls, American souls, who answered that call whenever it was raised. Have we forgotten them now? Have we forgotten that this creed is soaked in their blood and ennobled by their sacrifice? This is what makes us one nation. It now stretches back, as it did not before, beyond the statement of principle to the fact of all those who strove to make sure those principles would be upheld and respected, of all those who repented of the evils that violated them so that the world could be saved from premises that spit upon and violated the premises of God's endowment of right. We have a lot, I believe, to be proud of. But if we continue down a road in which we forget that the work that we deserve mostly to take pride in was in the end not done for ourselves. They want us to think this. What have you done for me lately? That's the definition of politics. I go out there, I'm going to tell you what I've done for you lately. How does that honor those who are not here to enjoy such benefits because they answered the call of battle? You know, when you have been struck down in a battle for right, it gives you little consolation to know that someone else is triumphant in a battle for licentious greed and lust because of your death. Is this how we honor those who have died? Is this how we honor those who have been maimed? Is this how we honor the discipline of those who fought with courage in the midst of a hell that no one who has ever experienced it denies? I don't think so. Time and again, our leaders have said, from Lincoln to Kennedy to Reagan, didn't matter the party in the past, they all understood that our brave dead have died in vain when we let go the self-evident truth for the sake of which they sacrificed, for the sake of which we came together in order to defend the future that they would never experience because they made the ultimate sacrifice so that we could know it. If all of this is true, then we have a duty to look at our polity not in terms of, what have you done for me lately? What are you going to get from me now? When will we wake up to the truth that as members of the sovereign body of the people, it is literally true to say that we are the kings and queens of our nation. That to be the king and queen is not to be crowned with glory and honored with false praise. It is to bear the sovereign responsibility for the welfare of your nation and its actions in the world. So that when we go to the voting booth, we're not thinking, what have they done for me lately? We're thinking, what must I do to benefit my community, to benefit my nation, to benefit my God so that my life can be a blessing to him and my nation can be a glory to his name? When can we return to this understanding of who we are? Only if we are willing to take a stand now. And there's one issue in this nation, and it's why I talk about it all the time, that exemplifies this truth more than any other. And exemplifies, too, the requirement that we can't afford to act as if the only time we need to move is when our ox is gored. It's like the devil's mocking us, and God is letting him do it by showing us that the ox that's being gored is life itself and humanity itself in the very womb of our care as a people. And we are doing it to death because we stand and do nothing when we are obliged by our God and by our creed and by our Constitution to put the slaughter to an end. When will we move? Are we waiting until the gray-haired elderly are under the knife? Are we waiting until those in depression and despair have been tempted to suicide? Are we waiting until they have allowed the invitation to mercy killing? To take those who really deserve our comfort and our support and our help and our discipleship and our love and lead them down the road to their self-destruction. What are we waiting for? Some say we're waiting for a decision of the Supreme Court. Well, the Supreme Court made its decision. But you know what we've forgotten? The Supreme Court is one of three equal branches. Those branches were intended to check and balance one another. If one of the branches departs from the truth and the authority of the Constitution, what are the other branches to do? Bow down and say, let the law of the land. If it violates the Constitution, tell me, how can it be the law of the land? That's the supreme law of the land. And the judiciary itself looks at that law, and if a law from the Congress, which has the authority to make the laws, contravenes the terms of the Constitution, they say, no, we can't apply that. Well, let me see. Equal branches sworn to uphold the Constitution. So, well, let's say a president or a governor gets something from the Supreme Court in an opinion, and it says, you've got to do something that involves depriving this innocent person of life, liberty, and property without due process of law. Withdrawing the equal protection of laws from this class of people. Are they to do it just because the Supreme Court says so? No. Are they to do it because some opinion has been read that in plain and open violation of the clear and readable text of the Constitution violates the terms of that supreme law? You're right. The answer is no, we are not. If the court is wrong, we are not obliged to respond to their opinions with a servile nod and the willingness to do their bidding. In matters of execution of their decisions, the first obvious balance is in the executive branch. So, judicial power, by the way, in the discussion by Montesquieu, some of you may be familiar with some of this. I'll go into it briefly. Because the founders looked at him for a lot of the discussion of the separation of powers, why we have three branches of government. He actually, in one part of his discussion, makes it very clear that in the nature of things, judicial and executive power are bound, right? Because no action can be made without a judgment about whether it is warranted by law. Therefore, judgment is required in order to act. They are bound together. We separate them to avoid despotism and tyranny and dictatorship in America. But does that mean that the executive is acquitted of his or her responsibility to look at the Constitution and abide by the oath they swear to uphold it? Are they to abdicate like good Nazis their conscientious understanding of right in order to execute what they know to be fundamentally wrong? And what is, in fact, fundamentally proven to be wrong now? You know, Roe versus Wade established as the key premise of whether that decision should stand or fall the suggestion of personhood. That's what Blackmun said. If the suggestion of personhood be established. Personhood, by the way, in the dictionary is especially the relevant one in 1828, which reflected the usage of the people who wrote the Constitution. It's defined as an individual human being possessed of a rational nature. Well, our rational nature is now better understood than ever through the discovery of DNA. Right? The rational way in which we develop and so forth, the rational markers that we can find scientifically that tell you that that's a human being, it's there. That's been established. Our Constitution always applied the word person, contrary to Blackmun's error, shall we call it. I don't want to call it a lie. But contrary to his error, the Constitution always applied the word person to a class of persons presumptively human whose humanity was in controversy. In the original Constitution, that class of persons was enslaved black people, and the word person is used in Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3 of the original Constitution as applied to enslaved blacks. So when he said that the Constitution does not apply the word, he wasn't quite telling the truth, was he? We now have two reasons to know. Roe versus Wade. Let me declare it clearly and succinctly because the Constitution demands it. Roe versus Wade has collapsed. Roe versus Wade is dead. Roe versus Wade can have no force of law because it plainly violates the Constitution's demand that no person be deprived of life without due process, that no state make or enforce any laws that withdraws from any person the equal protection of the law. If we mean to stand now as a nation who has proven our recommitment to the premises of our founding, then we must stand with one voice and demand of all those who claim they represent us that every abortion clinic under the power of any executive in our nation must be shut down forthwith so that our Constitution does not stand abandoned. This is not an issue of partisanship. This is not an issue of rebelliousness and lawlessness. This is an issue of whether or not we as a people mean to take the initiative to put us back into consistency with our Constitution and in conscience consistency with our own claim of unalienable right. God bless the ones who first step forward to make this clear to the nation, who by their actions step forward so that every American will realize if those who are trying to withdraw the equal protection of the law from the nascent children and the born children like Cuomo in New York, and the elderly like the folks who advocate the death panels under Obamacare, if they're trying to withdraw support of the Constitution, let them try to do it by constitutional amendment. Let them go through the process by which this people will declare the abdication of its conscience and the betrayal of its God. For then, instead of drifting to perdition, we will have well deserved it. And you can bet God will let us suffer the consequences of our abandonment. But if we mean to avoid it, we must force them to try, and we must defeat them when they do. For our Constitution of Liberty demands it, and we must stand forward in every way we can to prove that we still deserve that Constitution, because we have the moral and the physical and the courageous Constitution in ourselves as individuals required to stand firm so that our nation will survive. Will you do this? Because I think that the next election offers a perfect opportunity to stand forward and prove that we know what it requires to be free. It is not the largesse of government. It's not even the grant of the Constitution. Like salvation itself, the price has already been paid for our unalienable rights. The question is, will we return to God in order to claim that prize, which He has given us with the greatest sacrifice, so that we can endure to inspire others in that same path, which leads in the end, as it has before, to an example that can inspire all the human race to build a life of decency on God's understanding of right, so that someday, we will look at a world in which this nation never stands alone in the defense of justice and right according to God, because all decent humanity lives and prospers under rules and governments that have learned from us how to sustain them.
Thank you.